Good morning. Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us for today's Diversifying Political Engagement event with the focus on the LGBTQ plus IA community. My name is Alberto Olivas. I'm director of the Congressman Ed Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service. We're part of the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions here at Arizona State University, of which I am a proud alumnus. In any case, the Ed Pastor Center was created to help students and community members learn the skills for getting involved politically and civically. And so we've been doing this series now for a couple of years where we look at specific parts of our community and asking questions about, are we having the representation and voice that we ought to have in politics, in civics, and as elected officials, as appointed members to boards and commissions, in social and political change movements, all of those things. What are the barriers to having full voice and representation in all of those arenas? And how can we think about strategies to overcome those barriers so that our political reality, which should mirror the community that it represents? So that's what our conversation is about today. We've been doing this series for about 2 years, and we're very excited to be joined by some very cool panelists today to talk about LGBTQ plus IA issues in Arizona. But before we introduce them, I just want to start with a land acknowledgement. Here at Arizona State University, we sit in a very special place. So we like to always start our events by acknowledging, with respect, that the physical locations of the ASU Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions lie within the ancestral homelands of those American Indian tribes that have sustained connections to its lands and its waters since time immemorial. Over time, that has included many tribes, but specifically including the Acamel Autumn tribes, the Pima, the Pipash, Maricopa, Yavapai, Navajo or Diné, Apache, Quechan, and Tohono O'odham people. I'll also say my own heritage is Mexica and Maya and Wisharika, and the Mexica people also claim ties to this area. And I just a personal side note, really happy that a lot of the Arizona tribes here share that belief that my ancestors are also from this place. One last thing I'll say about the land acknowledgement is that it can sound past tense, but it's very important to keep in mind that these tribes are still very living, vibrant, growing, adapting tribes. They contribute much to the life of our state, and we should just always keep them in mind as partners and collaborators in everything we do to develop issues for our people, for our community, and thinking about the future of our state, that our tribes are with us and ought to be involved with us in all of those things. So that's that for the land acknowledgement. I will now turn to my partner in crime, Tiffany Thornhill, to introduce herself and take us into the next segment.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for that welcome. We'll say partner in good trouble because crime's already passed. But welcome everybody to our Diversifying Political Engagement webinar on the LGBTQ plus community's perspective, a community that is important to me as well. So I'm grateful to be here, to be one of your logistical facilitators for this conversation, and I will be here behind the scenes helping out. But I do want to just mention that please take this conversation in. Please use this content as a guiding force as you continue to work with this community, as you continue to develop policies and any sorts of decisions that you're making that would be impacting this community. Please do consider the impact as you're going along. So typically we do a screenshot at the end of the webinar. Let's do it at the beginning because I'm not sure if we're going to get it wrapped into the end there. Plus my lipstick is fresh. So let's go ahead and take a moment to get ourselves a screenshot. Are y'all ready? 1, 2. Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And with that, I will pass it over to Francis for Francis to introduce themselves. Actually, let me introduce myself a bit. Again, I'm the program manager here in the Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service. I'm also Spirit of Service Scholar alumnus. I think I said that right, Alberto. I'm learning how to say that term correctly. But if it wasn't for this center, I wouldn't be here today. If it wasn't for the congressman and his legacy and the platform that he has provided for us, none of us would be here today. So I also want to give thanks to the congressman, the late Congressman Ed Pastor, for providing this opportunity for us, and for all of the students that are impacted by the work that we do here in the Pastor Center. And with that said, I have a student intern that is here working with us. So we will have Francis come on forth and bring us an offering before we get started. Francis?
Hello, I am Francis Omens. I am Tiffany's intern for the year, and I will be reading A Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone, for those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us, for all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive.
Wow, thank you so much, Francis. And that poem, it resonates with me so much. So just my own connection to this topic. I was an undergrad at ASU back in the very early 90s, 91. And man, my coming out experience, to put a fine point on it, I almost didn't survive it. And I think for so many of us, it's not just the fear of the world and what the world will do to us, and if we are our sincere and true selves, it's also a fear of ourselves. And that was definitely the case for me. I was so afraid of acknowledging who I really was that I kept myself a secret from myself, and I lived a life that was someone else's. And after I went through all of that and got my degree and became a professional, I wanted to prevent other young people from going through the kind of experiences I had. So I did a lot of public speaking on issues related to coming out. And over time, I felt like I didn't need to do that as much anymore, because it seemed like people were coming out younger and younger, like in middle school, and everyone seemed to be great about it. And I just thought, well, we've made it. It's those issues from the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that I grew up with it's not a problem anymore. But it really seems like we can't take any of that progress for granted, and there's still so much more work to do, starting with letting us be accepting of ourselves. And the way that poem closed about having voice and speaking, when we're never meant to survive, speaking to change things, that's so powerful and so directly relevant to our topic today of political voice and representation and civic participation for our community. So I'm really, really excited for our panelists that we are going to have joining us to discuss all of these issues and their own stories related to these issues. So I've introduced myself. Let me go ahead now and ask our first panelist, State Representative Lorena Austin, to introduce themselves to you as well.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Tiffany and Alberto. It's always great to be back here, especially for the Pastor Center. I'm State Representative Lorena Austin. I have the honor and privilege of serving Legislative District Number 9, which is West Mesa and Tempe. I'm a fifth generation Arizonan. My family has lived in my district for over 100 years, but I do have a special attachment to this center because I am a former Spirit of Service scholar as well. I graduated in 2020 with a degree in Immigration Policy and Economy from the School of Transporter Studies and a certificate in cross-sector leadership from the Next Generation Service Corps at ASU. So I was really lucky to spend a lot of my time at ASU. Prior to that, I was at Mesa Community College, so I was a transfer student. But this is a great panel because in 2022, it's very personal to me. I was elected as the first Chicana non-binary legislator in the entire country. So I have, it's not something I intended to do or something that's not why I ran for office or anything, but it's a very important topic because it all of a sudden became something that was kind of put on my shoulders and something that I have carried my past 2 sessions here at the legislature. And so I'm excited to have this discussion and really talk about the issues that are pressing our community at this moment. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Representative Austin. Next, let me ask one of our colleagues, our good friend Trey Jenkins, to go ahead and introduce himself.
Thanks, Alberto. Thank you, Tiffany. And thank you, Francis. My name is Trey Jenkins. I use he, him pronouns. I am a senior program coordinator in the Watts College Office for Inclusive Design for Equity and Access. And I'm also a doctoral candidate in the School of Social Work. And my research is examining loneliness as sort of a construct of inequity. And so I look at how we think about systems and structures and how they're designed for exclusion, policies, all of those different things. And I did that specifically with a group of Black trans adults in the US. And so I sort of bring them, my co-researchers, my co-conspirators, I bring all of my trans sisters into the space with me, my Black trans sisters with me, to talk to you all today. So although I'm representing myself, I sort of bring them along with me in the conversation. So thanks for having me. And also nice to meet you, Representative Austin. Thanks for representing.
Thank you, Trey. And last but certainly not least is a very good friend and supporter of the Pastor Center, Dr. Shannon Portillo from the School of Social Work. School of Public Affairs. I don't know what I'm saying.
That's okay. Trey's from social work, so we're all good friends here. Thank you so much, Alberto, Tiffany, and Francis for organizing this. I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation today. As Alberto mentioned, I'm Shannon Portillo. I use she, her pronouns. I'm director and Lottie and Elva Core presidential chair in the School of Public Affairs. I have only been in Arizona for 2 years now. I have to quit saying that I'm new because it has been 2 years now. But I have done most of my work looks at how formal rules and policies and informal social norms shape the experiences of public officials. And so what that means is that I look at sexism, racism, homophobia, other isms, both historically and currently, and how that shapes public organizations and the work of public officials. I came from Kansas, which is where I grew up and where I did my undergraduate and graduate work, and I was on faculty at the University of Kansas for 10 years. While I was there, I also was elected to the Douglas County Board of Commissioners. Here we call them county supervisors. I was a county commissioner. When I was elected, I ran with a really good friend of mine, also named Shannon. And once we were elected, we were the first majority Shannon, majority millennial, majority queer county commission in the state of Kansas history. I am pretty sure we can claim that we don't have good data on names, sexual orientation, or generational identity, but I'm fairly confident I could say we were
Just claim it.
Majority of all those things. So I'm excited today to talk about this both from kind of my research vantage point and also as a former elected official. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Portillo from the School of Public Affairs. All right, so let's get right into it. And starting with the fact that today that we're recording this event is October 21st. In just a couple of weeks, we have what is likely to be one of the most consequential elections of at least my lifetime. So on November 5th, we have not just a presidential election, but many, many important issues on the ballot for Arizona, the state election, and as well as local issues as well. And I was reflecting back to the 2000 presidential election when I was going around to the Pride rally here in Phoenix and trying to get people to register to vote. And people were just walking past me laughing. Nobody took it seriously. I really was frustrated with the attitude of disinterest in voting and elections at the Pride Festival that year in 2000. Now, I think things have really changed since then for a lot of reasons. But I'd love to ask our panelists to reflect on, from your point of view, what are the issues of most concern or interest to the LGBTQ plus community for this coming election? And does that mean we can expect a higher turnout among the queer community as voters in Arizona? And also, from your experience, what do you think makes for things that motivate the LGBT community to come out and participate in elections? But also, what are some of the things that may keep them at home?
I don't know if we're going in any particular order, but I am happy to jump in on this one. I think that one of the complicated pieces is that when we say LGBTQIA plus community, we tend to think about a cohesive whole, and that's not necessarily always the case. And so we have to really think through what we mean when we say the words community. When I think about some of the biggest challenges, I think two main things when I think about voting. One is really around misinformation, and we're seeing a lot of misinformation about voting processes, particularly if you think about Spanish language voters. We're seeing an increase in misinformation when it comes to linguistic minority communities across the country, but particularly here in Arizona. And then also voting access. So trying to make it more difficult to vote. And as we see kind of the bar raised in how voting happens, we see changes in who we talk about as having that right and how you access that right. And so if we see kind of increased focus on forms of identification, then that can certainly disenfranchise folks who may have a harder time accessing and changing official government IDs. And so the pieces around how difficult and the administrative burdens we put on voting and misinformation are two things that I think really are challenges to overcome in this election season in particular. And they've only been getting kind of increasingly more difficult since that 2000 election that you referenced, Alberto.
Thank you, Dr. Portillo.
I think, I'll definitely come at this in a policy perspective and what's kind of at stake here. For me, it's the idea of understanding how federal can really impact state issues and vice versa. So, for example, here in Arizona right now, we have a very slim margin of majority minority. So Republicans are in majority by one seat. So 39 Republicans to 29 Democrats in the House and 16 Republicans to 14 Democrats in the Senate. So that means, and although we have a Democratic governor, Attorney General, and Secretary of State, I think people might not really understand that they're not in charge of creating the policies and the laws of the state. The legislature is in charge of doing that. And while the governor does have veto power, which has really been the backstop for a lot of the anti-LGBTQ issues we've had this past year have been vetoed by Governor Hobbs, thankfully. There's also a pathway for a simple majority to throw things on the ballot, which is why, and that surpasses the governor, which is why we see a lot of ballot measures. And it was only by one vote that a anti-LGBTQ ballot measure didn't make the ballot this year. And that was very startling. So my concern is this election cycle is so imperative and important, because if we happen to keep a Republican majority who has been the party introducing these anti-LGBTQ plus bills, and we happen to have a Republican president again at the federal level, and we continue to see protections from the federal Supreme Court roll back, I am very fearful of what could happen here at the state level. I think that, federally, we would not be held to a specific standard. And I think we would kind of be in the hands of a majority that we know is not interested in protecting the rights of the LGBTQ plus community. So that's why state legislatures are so very important, because if we flip the legislature here in Arizona, and we did happen to have a Republican in the White House, we could still, kind of hold the line here at a state level, right, and keep protections in place for LGBTQ plus people. We could actually pass laws if we had a Democratic majority that would, protect LGBTQ plus people. So that's kind of the reality, right? And there's all these different scenarios, and that's why when we talk about elections being very important, it is very important that we're utilizing our vote, if that's the issue that you care about, right? Because there is a very strong demarcation line between the two parties, unfortunately. But I do think it's an issue that does stem across party lines in some way. I know that. So that's just kind of an example of where my head's at in terms of what is next for us in this election cycle and what the possibilities could be.
Thank you for laying out just how much is at stake within this election for the LGBTQ community. My question to follow up on that is, what you just laid out in terms of the potential outcomes and consequences, is that well understood in our community? Are people talking about that? And maybe I'll ask Trey, when you're talking to your folks, are they talking about the election? And are they talking about it that in a way that makes you feel like they're clued in, informed, and planning to vote? What about the election are they saying? So I'm just, well, really for any of you, like, what do you hear people in our community, the LGBTQ community, talking about when it comes to this election? What are the things that they mention most?
Yeah, that's a great question, great follow-up. I think when I'm talking with folks, and even just myself, as a citizen or community member, is I think we all find ourselves in a place of survival more than anything else, and trying to understand, like getting the ballot and trying to understand all of it feels very overwhelming, and like I don't have time for that, to be quite honest. Like I don't have time to understand all of those things. And I think a lot of us know how incredibly important some things are. But we're fighting for fighting to get gender affirming hormones, and you have to go through a million steps and all sorts of paperwork to make that happen. So we're thinking about how healthcare is an important issue for us, or housing, or just wanting to be housed. And these are all survival things that honestly just make it really difficult to get into the deeper side of voting. So I think everyone recognizes it's important to vote, and at least among the circle of folks that I interact with more regularly, we're excited to vote and we recognize the importance of it, but also just sharing with one another how difficult it is to understand locally what is happening, and how we can be more informed. That just doesn't end up being another burden of learning at this point.
I just want to co-sign everything Trey said about exhaustion, because I think that the overwhelming feeling exhausted is something that I'm hearing from folks all over. And I think that a big piece of this is really a big part of what Representative Austin mentioned as well, is understanding kind of the federal, state, and local. And so we have a lot of local initiatives, we have a lot of state initiatives on our ballot here in Arizona, and it can be overwhelming to try to think through what's going on. And yet we're also being kind of inundated with a lot of federal political ads. I came from not a swing state and living in a swing state. I will say that the just radio, television, everything that's happening leading up to an election is a lot more exhausting, because you hear ads everywhere. And so really even digging in on some of the core policy issues where we have a lot of direct democracy initiatives on our ballot, it can be really difficult to just find the time and space and energy to engage in that.
I hear that. And I've been doing voter outreach work for a really long time, going back to the late 90s, and I'm tired too, And in Arizona, we ask a lot of voters compared to many states. A lot of you have seen your ballots. It's ridiculously long. 2 huge pieces of paper, front and back, small print. And, we do workshops to explain to voters how to understand what each of those ballot measures means. And as Rep. Austin referred to, the reason we have so many is it's a way to get around a government a gubernatorial veto is to go around the governor, put it in front of voters. So we have 13 ballot measures, and I think 11 of them are referred by the legislature. And they're just things that wouldn't have ever survived the governor's veto stamp. So we have 13 complicated, hard to understand questions. Towards the end of the ballot, when people have already kind of racked their brains trying to figure out all the other things out, it's a lot. And as Trey mentioned, when you're just trying to survive, that's not the first thing you're thinking of. So we have a lot at stake. We ask a lot of voters, and we really don't do what we need to do to prepare them to understand the choices that we're asking them to make. And then we guilt them for not voting and not participating afterwards. Like, well, why didn't you vote on this and that? So there's a lot to consider. But I want to go to something you mentioned earlier, Dr. Portillo, with regards to voter rights. In many places, voter suppression and access to the polls continue to be issues of concern on the left and the right. So rightly or wrongly, many people on the right have concerns about the integrity of our elections and the safety and validity of those drop boxes where you can drop off your mail ballots. And on the left, there are concerns about all the requirements to prove citizenship to register to vote, to prove identity when you show up at the polls. So let me ask you, from your experience and the people you talk to, what do you identify as particular barriers that impact the LGBTQ plus community in terms of voting rights? And how can civic organizations and us educators and everyone else that is concerned, what is it that we can do to better advocate for them and push for more inclusive voter access?
Absolutely. So I would say that one of the biggest issues that disproportionately affects the LGBTQ plus community is around the administrative burdens that many states are putting on voters these years, more recently. And so we're seeing an increase in kind of the administrative burdens around, you mentioned identification, registration, even purging of the polls when people haven't been active voters for a while, because we know that housing and housing stability tends to disproportionately affect the queer community. Identification and really tracking down IDs for identification, for changing identification, can be an increased burden. And then I'll say as well, kind of discretion of poll workers and folks when it comes to registration. So as I mentioned, I came from Kansas, and we had Chris Kobach as our Secretary of State for quite a while. And this wasn't because of queerness, but was because of my Latina identity. When I moved back to Kansas from DC, it was while Kobach was in office, and we had just passed some increased citizenship requirements for voting. And I was born and raised in the Midwest. I went to the DMV when I first moved back. I brought my passport with me, and the worker at the DMV told me that my passport wasn't proof of citizenship. Now, it could be that they just weren't a very well trained individual, but my mother, who's white with blonde hair and blue eyes, went with her passport, and she was able to register to vote. We don't know if it was the same worker or not. I ended up going to register online. It was fine. I was able to vote, but I think that it's one of those pieces where sometimes we may not know why someone denies us something, even when we have all of the correct documents, even when we are trying to exercise our rights with all of that knowledge behind it. And I was in a position of extreme privilege to be able to take the time to take another route to registration, to be able to call in friends and say, this is really annoying, and to have a space to vent and to kind of think through that piece of it. Not everyone has the luxury of time, the ability to gather those documents, the ability to try to do things twice. And so as we add these administrative burdens, I think that we're seeing disproportionate disenfranchisement of the queer community.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about how issues of housing instability can factor into that. So I'm really glad you raised that issue. And then with regards to the names issue and the mismatches between what your driver's license says and your voter registration record, it hadn't occurred to me to think about how that might disproportionately affect the trans community and gender non-binary voters. It's affected me, like you, as a Latino. A lot of us tend to have very long names, and we use different versions of our names for different things. I made Tiffany laugh the other day because she asked me what my original full name was, because I've shortened it. But originally it was Jose Alberto Esteban Reyes Lara de Olivas. And of course, I didn't have all of that on my driver's license or my voter registration record. So in the old days, when you had to go to the poll worker and tell them your name and have them find you in the book, it was always a problem to figure out which version of the name they had in their book for my voter registration record and whether or not that matched my driver's license. A real pain. I know something that happens. It's an issue for women with regards to name changes related to marriage or divorce. But it hadn't not even occurred to me the challenges that trans people have with documents, getting documents in their right name and all of those things. Is that something that any of you hear people talking about as a reason why they're not able to participate?
Well, I will say it's also something that is disproportionately affecting college students because when folks move, um, being able to keep track of that. And we know that folks in younger generations are also more likely to identify with the queer community. And so that's another area where we're seeing disproportionate effects. And as Representative Austin pointed to earlier, federalism makes a huge impact on this because we have different requirements based on different states. And so being able to kind of point to that exhaustion that Trey pointed out of just knowing what your rights and responsibilities are in the jurisdiction that you're currently in. It's a big effort.
Are any of you familiar with organizations that assist, that can provide support, especially for trans folks that need help getting documents that would satisfy the voter ID and voter registration requirements and that match with their names? Is anyone doing that kind of outreach and support?
There are, I would say, and also it ties into when I think of documentation, I also think of our undocumented folks that are living here too, and how that can be really impact a lot of things, right? As they're trying to navigate just the legal systems in general. There are organizations like Vote Writers, and they help people actually obtain the documents if they don't have documentation. They'll help you go down to the DMV. They'll help you pay for even a ride down there if you don't have it. They'll sit with you and go through the process. So that's a really good organization in general. Other organizations like Aliento, which I know is very queer friendly and at least can help, navigate the process for our undocumented community. There's also, I'm really mad, but there's an app that you can use, and I'm gonna find it before the end of this. I'll get on my phone and check it out. But there's a lot. There are thankfully some resources that are available. AZ Typo is a good organization. It's a for trans parents organization here in Arizona. We work a lot with them at the Capitol. But HRC is really great. So there are a lot of organizations that can help, but it does get really complicated. And that's kind of the issue here, right, that we're talking about is unfortunately, it's not just the local access, but too, we have to think about like our rural communities as well and the access that they have to ballot boxes. And that was something we struggled with in the legislature this year of, providing more of these boxes, especially when you have a group that is very dead set on saying that elections are not safe. So we don't want to provide more because it would increase the chances that more, plagiarism or whatever, they assume is happening will happen. But even though we have data to show that that's not the case, right? Even right now, in Maricopa County, at least, right, we have a Republican recorder, right? And we still have entities on that side that say that they're not doing a good job and they're allowing all of these fault things to happen. So it's hard when the laws are not friendly to this community. So they're still really difficult to navigate. And yeah, if you are part of the LGBTQ community or you're transitioning and you don't look like, unfortunately, we still adhere stereotypical standards of what someone looks like that's supposed to be associated with the gender. And then if your name doesn't match that association, it's an automatic, sorry, we might not be able to help you, or we just can't. This doesn't align. But that's also just given on someone's personal opinion, right? So we have to be really mindful of how we navigate this issue. And, as always, if people run into any issues, they're more than welcome to reach out to my office and hopefully we can assist.
Is it still the case that is it difficult or not as difficult as it used to be to, for example, just get an updated driver's license with your chosen name instead of having your dead name on your driver's license? Is that still an issue in Arizona today?
Yeah, I think it's not particularly super easy to do. And one, I think people initially just have an initial thought that they are not allowed to do this, right? But we definitely don't have, again, this is kind of the issue. We don't have like overly helpful policy, right? That could make this as easy as possible. Can it be done? Yes. But is it extremely helpful, or could someone easily decide, oh, this is not worth it to do? Yeah. And that's unfortunate. So, my, goal is to hopefully make it just at least easier or more accessible to navigate, because already governmental processes and, bureaucracies are very hard yeah, to follow for anything. So much less, trying to do this very important, change in your life. So, I think it should be treated with respect and fairness, and have the tools associated, and still have to go through a process, right? But we could be doing things to make it a lot more easier.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think
Yeah,
I'd
I
like to
had
switch. Oh, go ahead, Trey. No, please.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I had a friend recently who moved, but prior to them moving, it took them just about a year, I think, to get their correct documents because they were continually put into some sort of hassle. Initially, just needing to see the gatekeeping that took place of needing to see a therapist in order to get to a place where you can get a letter to get approved to actually do the thing. Then once they did that, there was just they lived in another state before, so yeah, there was a lot of like trying to find older paperwork or things needed, and it was the bar, right? The line kept moving for this particular individual until they finally were able to get it, which was great. They had a lot of support, they had a lot of privilege in that, and having support and there's their own determination to get it done. But shout out to some places too. TZAZ in Phoenix area, Saga in the Tucson area. Those are all places that do name change clinics. Tomorrow We Vote works with young folks, and they're also queer friendly. So shout out to all those groups that help folks out.
Well, it's really good to know that there are organizations that are working on those issues and providing that support, because as you said, if it takes that long, it's like how many people stop trying after a while? Like a year that's just amazing to hear. It would take a year to get to that point. So that's very discouraging, but also encouraging to know that there are groups that have identified that issue and are providing that critical support. So thanks for letting us know about that. All right, so switching gears a little bit, I've been reflecting a lot on Arizona's politics over the last 30-ish years, and how, relatively speaking, it feels like over time we've had decent political representation in terms of elected officials from the LGBTQ community. I'm thinking of legislators like Ken Chevront and Tom Simplot. I remember back in the mid 90s when Tempe mayor at the time, Neil Giuliano, came out. He was the first out gay mayor of a major US city in the country. And it was a big deal. Like nowadays, we think like, so what? A mayor, who cares about an out mayor? But in the 90s, that was mind-blowingly shocking. And of course, he had challenges politically, and he survived them. But since the Neil Giuliano era, it feels like we've had several, at least state legislators that are out. And now, of course, we're joined today by Representative Austin, who was the first Latino Latinx non-binary legislator in the country elected to a state legislature. That's a big deal, but is it where it ought to be? So the question is, representation in political office has been a critical issue for many marginalized groups. How do you view the current state of LGBTQ plus political representation in Arizona at the local, state, and national levels? Is it where it should be? If not, why not? And what more can be done to ensure greater inclusion and representation? So that's not just elected officials, it's also people serving in appointed office, people serving in leadership capacities in government agencies, and people involved in campaigns, social and political campaigns of all stripes. What are your reflections on 2024 in Arizona? How are we doing with regards to political representation?
So I would love to answer this question as a researcher first. And a big part of that is that we don't have very good data on this. So I completely agree with kind of the anecdotal feeling of 2024 is very different than when I first started voting in 2002, and when we heard a lot about first, and we're still hearing about first, but I think you're right, it's becoming more normalized to see queer folks in office. And we don't actually have good data. I mean, when I introduced myself, I said that we were the first majority queer county commission in the state of Kansas. I don't actually know whether that's true or not, because no one has ever, we don't fill out a form that discusses our sexual orientation or even our gender identity when we become elected officials. And so how we understand who is represented can be really difficult. And I think there are a lot of really great organizations that are trying to gather those data, but we don't have very good data on what representation truly looks like for the queer community, even less so than what we have. And we don't have good data either on racial or ethnic data, gender identity data, or generational data. I will say, I think that while representation is getting better, there are some really important systemic barriers, and some of that is generational. And so it's really hard to be a local or state elected official. If we think about Arizona, we have a part-time legislature. We have a part-time legislature that doesn't pay very well. And so if you're thinking about someone who's just starting their work life or their mid-career, it's a really big sacrifice to ask someone to take on these types of roles. And we're traditionally seeing people who have a lot of independent wealth, who are, or family and generational wealth, who are taking on elected positions. And again, this is an area then where we see disproportionate disenfranchisement of queer individuals. And so I think that there are systemic barriers that we need to think through about the elected side. When it comes to appointed, and of course, my favorite public officials, the bureaucrats who keep everything running, this is also something where I think we need to make sure that we understand our history. We tend to talk about bureaucracies as kind of neutral or faceless, but we had the lavender scare here during the progressive era, as we started seeing kind of the professionalization of federal, state, and local government in the 1920s and 1930s, where we saw a very intentional and intense purging of queer folks from office. And I think that we still have some of the remnants of how heteronormativity has been really reinforced in some of the hiring practices and recruitment practices and retention practices of bureaucracies kind of nationwide. And until we really understand where we've come from historically and where we're at currently, I think it's going to be hard for us to be truly representative and inclusive in either the appointed or the elected side. And right now, we see also with the kind of discussion of Schedule F and the push for more political appointees rather than career civil servants, this is another area where we can see folks who, because of their lived experiences and identities, may be pushed out of career civil service roles where they have the opportunity to really engage and bring communities in. So I think that these are moments where we've seen a ton of progress, and we still need a better understanding of our history and better data to know where we're truly at and how much work we have left to do.
Very good points.
Yeah, I think it's been very interesting for me, obviously, personally, entering a sphere and a political arena where, you know, being the first of something, I didn't really understand the magnitude of it until I had a specific instance in my appropriations committee, and we had seen all this anti-LGBTQ plus bills come through, and the pronoun bill happened to be put in a committee where it didn't belong, but if you're majority, you can put a bill in any committee you want. So it happened to come through appropriations when it should have been in education, but this was the pronoun bill. It's the pronoun bill that would have criminalized teachers for addressing a student in a preferred pronoun or a nickname or something that was not agreed upon, and would literally criminalize our teachers. And so for me, it was really impactful. I hadn't really decided what I was going to say, but the senator introducing the bill said something very prolific and denigrating to our children, and said, you know, parents have every right to know that something is wrong with their children. And that just really sent me to a place where I knew I had to say something, and it just happened to come organically. And it's where for the first time I said out loud, nothing that I confessed. People, it's never something I hid, but addressed about me being non-binary and how this would have impacted me as a young person. It was the first time someone who was from that specific community could address this bill, and that hadn't happened before. And that speaks to the importance of having diverse elected officials in a room talking about policy that will impact our constituents every single day, at every level of their lives. So it's incredibly important. And that was something that didn't really dawn on me until that moment, why it's important. But I think too, understanding that, our community is also intersectional, right? We're very intersectional. We're not just part of this community. Prior to this, I had experience in higher education, right, for about 10 years. That was my background. I have experience being very active in my community. Not necessarily in just LGBTQ plus groups, right? Which is this big assumption that people have about us. And so what we can do to ensure more inclusion, I think that's true what Dr. Portillo said in terms of having, access to these spaces where people can be compensated so they can go. I think people have this idea, I always hear, man, I wish we had good candidates to run for these positions. No, we absolutely have amazing candidates in every single neighborhood, community, city, town, but no one can really survive on $24,000 a year. And while it's supposed to be part-time, it's very much full-time, and the legislature has been dragged out. It's supposed to end about April. This last year, we didn't end till almost August in my first session in June, and the one we just finished. So currently right now we have 4 legislators, and hopefully we'll gain some more in the next cycle here in Arizona. But it's really important to know that, well, one, they come from Latina backgrounds, which is really interesting and great to see. So we see that intersectionality, inclusivity amongst the Democratic caucus here. And so yeah, I think it's very critical to have representation, because again, we're not just representing the queer community, we're representing so many different communities along the way. And so I think it's very important that we have people. And also I think that's true, the data points that we don't have, there are people who are not out, and that's okay. People can choose when and where. People are still, figuring. It's the cue, the questioning, right? A part of our community as well, but we just want to ensure that everyone feels welcome, but also having these experiences really impact the policies that we create. And naturally, if you have people that are part of this community, they're going to create more inclusive policies just by the very nature of us being there, because we understand that we need intersectional policies to advance if we're going to have collective progress.
No, so much food for thought there. And then you mentioned we've got 4 state legislators currently. They're all from the Latino community, which is that is super interesting. But it also got me thinking, Arizona, I think we've had out members of Congress before, starting with, I think the first that I can think of is Jim Colby, a Republican member of Congress from Southern Arizona. He actually was not out, he was outed. And I believe it's hard to say that the reason he lost his primary for re-election was because of being outed and being a Republican, that didn't fly. But that was quite a while ago. Then we saw Kirsten Sinema elected the first bisexual member of Congress from Arizona, and enjoyed, at least initially, very popular support. So do you think, is this something voters still care about? Does it matter to voters whether elected officials are LGBT or not?
I do want to make one quick clarification. There is a Republican, Matt Gress, but he's not.
That's right.
Has chosen not to be part of the LGBTQ caucus, but there is one. So there are technically 5. There's 4 from the Democratic caucus and 1 from the Republicans.
Thank you for that.
I think to answer your question, Alberto, I think it really depends when we say, do voters care about this? I think that we are at a moment where we have kind of more popular representations and understanding of a spectrum of lived experiences. And so people are more familiar with the queer community. And so I think that they're more accepting of having conversations about it and seeing folks on the ballot. But I think we're also at a really politically divided time. And so we can't just say the voters and are the voters okay with things. I think that that's where we may have voters who are pushing for more LGBTQ representation, and we may have voters who are pushing really hard against that. But we can't say that the voters as a monolith kind of feel a particular way. We do know from good survey research that people are more accepting of the queer community than they used to be. And so I think that that does mean that we can have more open and honest conversations, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Next, I'd like to think about the role of our community in social advocacy and social change efforts. And we know that going back to the early 20th century, starting with examples I can think of from the 20s and 30s and 40s, not even the 60s, LGBT communities have historically been at the forefront of many social advocacy and civil rights movements. So it's been the queer community that has pushed things like women's rights and reproductive rights, Black civil rights, Latino civil rights, disability issues, and on and on. So what lessons can we learn from the past and present LGBTQ plus social advocacy efforts? And how can those lessons be applied to other marginalized groups fighting for equity and justice?
I can take a stab here. I think, and it's probably a little bit tied to the last question too. I think what's most important is that we are bringing many, many variations of ourselves to the polls when we vote and the things that we're thinking about. And so I think what's most important in terms of advocacy is as one of the select few that do are honored with being elected, is just remembering to listen to those, continuing to listen to those folks and to remember our history. So much of it is being erased or not included, and then you see, right, well, all of the stuff with the anti-DEI and trying to remove history. It's becoming even more difficult to remember that, right? I didn't ever learn how much Black trans women held it down all those years of doing really grassroots advocacy work. And so being able to understand that, I think is important, and just knowing that not all of us can be there in the room, but knowing that the people who are in the room are willing to come and listen and hear and do their best to represent us more broadly.
Thank you, Trey. I'll also mention for our attendees that are watching and listening that you can use the Q&A function in your navigation bar to pose questions that you would like the panelists to respond to. And we're going to be getting to those in about 10 minutes. So I just think, like you said, Trey, it's fascinating the role that particularly trans activists have played in all of those civil rights fronts. But those stories tend not to be documented. We know of them; they're orally transmitted, but they're not typically in books and not written about in political treatises. So I think you're right to point out how we're in danger of losing a lot of that history. So what can we do to help create a more pervasive awareness and understanding and appreciation for the role of gay and trans activists and moving forward all of these civil rights fronts, interracial marriage, and on and on. I think otherwise we can only expect to see more whitewashing of a lot of these stories, like the recent movies about the Stonewall riots, where it seemed like young white guys did all the work, and we know that wasn't the case. Nothing against young white guys. It's just not, that's not the history. The history was, it was Black trans women that really were the ones that said, enough of this, we're not going to take this anymore, and stood up for themselves and for the broader community. So what can we do to help make sure that those stories don't get lost, and that those stories get preserved in the consciousness, especially for younger members of our community that may not have seen those stories told or heard of those stories?
I think a big piece of this is making sure that we kind of respect history and think about the way that we're educating folks, because many people don't know about these histories, and it's not their fault that they don't know. we see kind of very little civics education in K through 12 currently, if we're even talking about kind of the processes of how governments function, let alone kind of thinking through the really complex and deep histories of our democracy. And so I think it's really important for us not to shame folks when they don't know about these histories, but create spaces where they can learn about them. And that is one of the roles of higher education. I think that's one of the roles of these types of spaces. I think it's also one of the things that is our responsibility as members of any community is to think through how we share histories. You mentioned kind of the oral tradition, and I think that's really important, but how do we also create spaces to make sure that these histories are preserved? And so some of that is happening in higher ed. We're seeing some of that under attack as well, that is being discussed as kind of indoctrination of students, when in reality, this is making sure that there are spaces to have discussions about the nuanced histories of our communities. And so part of that is being vocal in protecting spaces of higher education, being vocal in protecting spaces to have these difficult conversations, and to make sure that we're not shaming people when they don't know, but that we're inviting them in to learn.
Yeah, I think those are all really incredibly important points. And I think too, when we look at our history, and it's very true, I didn't learn much about my own background, especially here in a transborder, region, right? And understanding the different narratives, right? Because we have to remember the victor gets to write the narrative. And so when you have a siloed narrative, you only learn one piece. And so to that point, we have to make sure that we're also holding space for people that only received one narrative their entire life and really might not know the other stories and histories of other people that they interact with every single day. And we think of indigenous communities here in Arizona. I mean, they are the ones that have the least amount of rights, unfortunately. And so I think it's always highlighting that and bringing that to the forefront. And yes, many people might, revere these communities and go to the events and say they want to support, but at the very end of the day, are not really driving the improvements that they need, especially socially, economically, all of these things. So it's really bringing these issues to the forefront and to out in the open. I think too, my piece as a public official now is really making sure that when I talk about specific issues, we are highlighting these communities, we are recognizing and maybe providing some history. Also, I like increasing access to knowledge. So you'll see, especially with maybe some younger legislators, I guess, not necessarily always younger, but going live, right, on social media and providing that immediate access for people to really see what's going on, because we've had such a detached relationship between government entities and the people that we serve. So I think that's incredibly important, and to really highlight and breaking down what is actually happening, what is the process, because too, you could say, for me, knowledge is power, right? So a lot of people don't even really understand how bills are actually made and passed right here in the state legislature, and how that really impacts them every single day. Or someone could say to me, hey, we elected you because you said you were going to do X, Y, Z and all these things, and then you didn't do that. So what happens? Like, oh, well, I can't because we don't have majority, and so they won't hear these bills. That's why I never make like really hard promises, because I have to explain what is the process and how does it work. And I think we all need that collective understanding. But then that really, I think, empowers people too to want to make change, and then offering how can we make change? What can we do? Here in Arizona, that's by flipping, the legislature if you want to see those policies passed, type thing. So there's a lot. It all comes back to education for me. If someone asked me, what could I change and what do I think would really change the mindset of communities to really advocate for themselves, or for us to have a better collective understanding, it would be investing in public education, and really also making the concerted effort to make sure that everyone's narratives are being presented, because they're all equally important, because we really can't understand how to move forward in the future if we can't understand the past and present and how we got here.
That last point is so important, and it makes me think about how, if we don't know what was possible and what was accomplished in the past, it affects what we think is possible now. And the example I always tell is how I graduated from Arizona High School. I got my bachelor's and my master's from Arizona universities. Was working in Hispanic community uh, professional organizations for years before I ever heard of Raul Castro. His name never once came up in all of my education and professional involvements. It was a white Republican lady, my boss at the time, Secretary of State Betsy Bayless, who mentioned Governor Raul Castro to me, and I had never heard of him before. And she was horrified. She worked in his administration. She was a staffer for Governor Castro, and she couldn't believe that I had never heard of him. And so since then, I often talk to young Latinos in high school and college, and I ask them if they know who he is, and rarely have they heard of him. It's still the case, and that's a problem. If you know that a Mexican immigrant, naturalized citizen, was elected governor in Arizona in 1974, that shapes what you think can be done 50 years later in 2024. If you don't know that, then it really drastically alters your perception of what is possible for you and for anyone. But if you think about that time, the 70s was a time of much more overt and blatant racism. For a Hispanic immigrant to be able to be elected governor in Arizona, that's a powerful story that I think can really affect young Latinos' aspirations and ideas of where they can fit in. But similarly, if young LGBTQ people don't know these stories about the critical role that the queer community played in a lot of these social justice movements, then that might affect their sense of power and their sense of ability to do things that make a real difference. So I think it's just really incumbent on all of us to think about what role we can all play in preserving those stories and protecting the rights of those stories and those narratives to be represented in libraries and schools and curriculum and so on and so forth. So I think this is a really critical issue for all of us to consider.
Yeah, I think that is really critical. I think sometimes people might get tired of, oh, representation matters. If you can see it, you can be it. But I think that's absolutely true. I think for me, if you know the history of my district, this is where the SB 1070 Show Me Your Papers policy came out of, my district here in Mesa. And while they changed the district since then, and now I represent West Mesa has typically been represented by wealthier, more conservative white people. And that's just been our collective history. So when I ran in 2022, I obviously ran as myself and I was, publicly out at that time, but I don't think that's why I necessarily won my race at all. I think, people wanted to see someone who looked like them, someone who was part of their community, who had been part of it, who understood it, who knew how to stretch a dollar, who could maybe be more relatable. I think that's what people are looking for. And I'll relate that to the current campaign we're seeing for president right now. I mean, the shift dramatically changed the Democratic Party in terms of support from President Biden stepping down and having Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, run. I mean, it was palatable. I felt it. I felt the energy. And I think part of that was that she fit a demographic that could maybe see themselves, in her story from a variety of reasons, from socioeconomic background to ethnicity, to being a woman, gender. And there's just so many variables at play, but people, I think, are looking for, doesn't have to be a more diverse option, but just someone who is relatable to themselves. And I think that's something that's really critically important as well. They're just looking for everyday people. They're not looking for polished politicians anymore, because what has that gotten them, right? They're looking for someone who they think that they could actually reach out to and get an answer or get some help from.
Well, already several times today, all three of you have mentioned at one point or another how we hold multiple identities and what we're doing and the work we do and how we interact with each other. So let me ask you to think about how LGBTQ plus individuals often, very commonly hold multiple marginalized identities. And like just myself as an example, I strongly identify as Latino, as Hispanic, as Mexican American, also someone with invisible disabilities. So disability communities are forefront in my mind. I'm from a military family, so I have a lot of concern about issues that affect military dependents and families and so on and so forth. So we have all of these identities that inform what we do and what we're paying attention to. How do the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, etc., influence political engagement for LGBTQ plus people? And how can intersectional approaches strengthen advocacy for more inclusive policy?
So could I be the real academic on the panel and ask to kind of reframe the question a little bit? I think that I really appreciate intersectionality as a framework. I think that Kimberly Crenshaw, who originally coined the term in 1989, is an academic goddess and has done amazing work. And at its core, intersectionality is really a legal framework to say kind of how do we see these multiple marginalized identities create spaces where our laws that are even meant to help protect no longer do. But I think intersectionality as a term has kind of been pushed to mean just the multiple parts of myself rather than really thinking through these multiple marginalizations, which I think is how you're really framing the question, which I appreciate. But I think we could go kind of a step further. And I think about this through, I'm just going to go with even more complex academic terms here, translocational positionality. And that really means that our identities are primed based on who we're interacting with. And so the relationship aspect of identity is really important. So I identify as a queer Latina woman, but I would say that most of my staff probably don't think about my queerness as the primary identity because I, as a queer woman married to a man, rarely kind of present in really external ways as queer. And so most folks see me first as a woman, as a Latina, as someone who isn't from here, here being Arizona, not the US, but how we kind of define what it means to be part of a community. So I think that anytime we talk about identity, we talk about how our identities are primed in a particular moment and what that means for who we're interacting with. And I think that that says a lot about who we're engaging with in particular time. And when it comes to politics, I say this all the time that President Crow can walk into a room and people can read whatever kind of partisanship they want to onto him as a straight presenting white man. But when I walk into a room, because of my gender, because of my ethnicity, people are going to assume a particular political party. So even when we talk about issues of political engagement that are nonpartisan, but are still political, I think that our identities make it so that we're read in particular ways. And as we think about the multitude of marginalized identities, we get read as having particular politics when we enter rooms. So it makes it really hard for us to then be taken seriously as kind of researchers and advocates. And that I think can be challenging in this particular moment where we're seeing kind of so much, I will say, just scary hate-filled things happening. So I learned recently that I was put on Turning Point USA's watch list, professor watch list. I didn't know that I was on there until
Oh
a
my
good
God.
colleague
That's
texted me to tell me. And what was fascinating to me is that I was put on in May. I didn't have anything new or particularly I was actually just coming back from parental leave in May of 2024. So I didn't have anything new or groundbreaking come out at that point. But they were just pulling news stories about old work that I had done around exactly what we've been kind of talking about, the history of marginalization of public organizations and public officials. And it can be really scary because for me, that's a safety issue when it comes to my family potentially being in harm's way, being doxxed. What does that mean? Kind of as we think about safety and engaging these spaces. And my own kind of personal politics and my own personal values mean that I'm going to continue to speak out and be on panels like this, in spaces like this, because I think it's important that we don't allow those types of things to scare us into silence. But as folks who have multiple marginalized identities, this is a moment where we're starting to see kind of more targeting of that in ways that didn't used to happen as quickly and as readily because of social media, because of the ways in which people can find personal information about us. And that I know gives some people pause, but I hope that we can create spaces where we can come together and have real conversations about them and know that some of us, like me, have many more privileges when it comes to this because of what identities are primed in particular spaces. But the more that we have these conversations, I think the better it is for all of us and the safer it is for all of us.
Just to build on that, Arizona made national news headlines, I think it was last year, when we did have that instructor that was assaulted by members from Turning Point USA. And that provoked a lot of discussion across the country about what's happening in these spaces, with the targeting and the doxing and so on and so forth. But based on that experience, uh, how do you think that might impact the ways that young people, students, and faculty show up to represent themselves politically? And how can we support them so that they continue to do what you just said? You know, not let fear silence them, not let the concerns about what could happen keep people from stepping forward and speaking into those spaces.
I do really appreciate the way that President Crow very directly addressed that situation and very directly said, like, this is putting the watch list in particular is putting faculty safety on the line, and that's a problem. I think that our university, more than many other universities, has been speaking up in this space and saying that we can balance free speech while keeping people safe. And I think that that allows more space for us to speak up, but institutions aren't necessarily designed to keep individuals safe. And I think that's where we have to really think through how are we creating communities where people know that they can speak up and know that they have support when they do. So that's where I appreciate the Pastor Center for having events like this to even bring people together to say, here are leaders in our communities and we're speaking up, we're being a part of that. And so we can create space for students coming after us.
Thank you, Dr. Portillo. And kind of building from that in terms of keeping people safe, I would say safe and well. So I wanted to look at emotional wellness and social stigma and how that plays into all the things we've been discussing. Social stigma, discrimination, and the trauma associated with navigating a world that can be very hostile to LGBTQ plus identities has a significant impact on our emotional wellness. How do these experiences shape the mental health of LGBTQ plus individuals? And what role can political and civic engagement play in addressing the mental health needs of our community?
May I? This is a lot about my dissertation, so I'm going to do my very best not to go on a complete rant and then folks can't understand me. So what I'm hearing from my co-researchers and my collaborators in the study is that so much of racism, anti-trans antagonism, um, accessibility issues, all of the ways in which these were showing up in their lives from sometimes the earliest places and in what they perceived as the most safe places within their families, within their religious institutions. We're learning really early that hostility and that trauma of exclusion. And then it's interesting because then you have two different stories being told, right? There's the story of exclusion, and then there's the story now emerging of loneliness and mental health. And so loneliness is being considered an epidemic. There's a lot of attention drawn to how we can help people not feel lonely. But then we're just forgetting that loneliness doesn't have to derive just from these particular encounters of something like divorce or being widowed or just getting older, right? These are all things that are important and concerning when it comes to loneliness, but recognizing that there's a great deal of trauma that comes along with discrimination at these various intersections of identity or discrimination. And there's a particular, well, I'll be careful because I still got to write my dissertation, so I can't tell all the stories. But I can say that one particular person, and this is recent, right? This is in the 2000s. This is pretty recent. This person, based on their perceived identity as being queer and being Black, was essentially chased out of a sundown town, um, and harassed and like violently chased out as they were traveling from the Pacific Northwest back down to the Southwest. And it's things like that that just completely terrified a person. And then that person, then ultimately retreated into their home. And so much of now everything is then filtered through that trauma or through that violence. And it's really, really difficult to come back out of that, to engage back in the world, to feel safe, to feel well, to feel whole. And it's happening. And I think just most importantly, at least with my research and when we're talking about the history, is really just being careful, like remembering how important it is to tell these stories, to hear these stories, and to witness these stories as true and happening and important and critical to how we think about how policies are created or designed, or how places and spaces are created and designed, and how are we intentionally or unintentionally creating that sense of trauma or lack of safety.
Thank you so much, Trey. I would love to come to your thesis defense or your final presentation. It sounds really important and impactful.
I appreciate that. And one of the questions I asked all of them was, like, what would you want to tell a researcher or a politician or a helping professional? What would you want to tell them? And one person said something that just sticks with me no matter, like everywhere, it's just constantly in my head. And it is, they put it back and said, what would it take for you to care? And that at the end of the day, that is what they all wanted. That's what we all want, is what does it take for you to care?
That makes me think of an experience I had back when I worked for the Maricopa Community Colleges. The 10 colleges unanimously, the college presidents and their diversity councils unanimously recommended to the board of directors a change to the discrimination policy for the college district. And they recommended change to the verbiage to be inclusive of the phrase gender identity and expression as part of the groups that would be protected formally in their non-discrimination policies. It was so controversial. The board of the governing board, the elected trustees that oversee the community college district, didn't frankly want to vote on that issue. And the chancellor called on me to moderate a forum, a community forum, on the proposed non-discrimination language and the violent opposition to it. There were legislators and church leaders coming out of the woodwork, frankly, making threats against the chancellor and the governing board if they were to consider such change to their policy. The forum we had, I set it up where we had proponents of the change on one side of the dais and opponents, people that were against that new language on the other side. And I just posed questions, asking them each side to respond to things like, how did they feel they were misrepresented by the other side? And why was this an issue of importance for a higher ed institution? And how did this affect students and faculty and staff and community members, things like that. It went really well, but I feel like what was more important than the questions and the responses from the panelists on both sides was just getting them all in one room to hear each other's stories. And there were some very courageous trans students that spoke about their experiences in the classroom, on campus, in the community, and former employees who talked about how these issues affected them and how ultimately they had to leave and go work somewhere else because of harassment and issues like that. I think hearing those stories really was a powerful experience for a lot of people that previously had zero personal interaction with members of the trans community. And I mentioned all of that to say that when we were done and the forum was over, people did not leave the room. So conservative legislators and religious leaders got up and walked across and shook hands and hugged and talked with the members that were there from the trans community and really wanted to know more. And it was a magical moment. The governing board tabled that decision, so they didn't vote on it, and that felt like a defeat for the people that were pushing for that change. But it came back up again 4 years later. I believe it was 4 years later, and it passed overwhelmingly. But it took that initial experience of interacting and seeing the humanity in each other, where initially people walked into the room and looked across at each other and saw monsters. But afterwards, they saw beautiful people with moving stories. And that was really, I felt like, the start of what needed to happen to get to the change that was ultimately what they were working for. So I just feel like if we had more opportunity to interact and engage with each other, it would bring down a lot of those false perceptions, the fear and the hatred and misconceptions that can spring up when all you're confronted with are stereotypes and memes and things of that nature. Okay, I wanted to go back to another issue that we touched on earlier with regards to partisanship. Arizona, as I think you're all aware, is a solidly purple state at this point. That is, I think, still generally viewed as deep red. So the perception of our state compared to what we actually are in terms of voters is quite different. There's a big gap there, especially if we look, and I'm drawing on my hat as an election and voter outreach guy, if we look at young people and young queer people, young folks in the LGBTQ plus community, overwhelmingly when they register to vote, they are not registering as members of a political party. They're registering and voting as true independents. So what are the implications for that? The LGBTQ plus community is often seen as politically diverse. We've had very significant Republican, conservative LGBTQ organizations and movements in our state, as well as Republican LGBTQ politicians. Yet certain partisan alignments tend to dominate, despite the fact that the independent representation is only growing over time, particularly among young people. So how do members of our community, the LGBTQ plus community, navigate partisan spaces? And what are the implications of partisan affiliation on LGBTQ plus rights and broader political participation?
I can, I guess, jump in here, and I think it's really interesting to grow up in a place like Arizona and grow up in a place, particularly where I joke that I grew up in a mixed party household, right? And I think I still do. My family is very mixed politically. And I'm kind of really proud of my family for being able to still have constructive conversations with one another. And I think at the very end of it, we know that our personal relationships are really important to us. But also, I think too, to speak to, my district is the closest in the entire state. There's nothing closer in terms of party-wise. So it's actually less than a percentage point between Republican and Democrats. But also the point that people don't also see is we also have a lot of independents. And if you looked at it between the three parties, it's a third, a third, a third. So we have a third independents. Actually, independents, I think, are larger than both the Dems and the Republicans. But I think that's really important because I think, especially with the younger generation, they are not adhering to a specific side. And also, they want someone that is going to come to them and someone that is going to speak to them, that the issues are, what issues are important to them. And they're not willing to, I guess, bend to either side for what they want. And I think they have a higher expectation of what they expect from politicians these days. Because also I think being boxed is also a part of it too, right? Like being boxed into even a certain demographic, or because we're already boxed so much just by existing. I think so maybe that gives them the choice as well. So I think choice is really important to our community, and freedom to choose. So that might be why they're being more comfortable in that space. And I hope our academic can maybe provide some more research on that. But that's just how I feel in general, because you know, it's become so extreme on each end of the political spectrum. I've run into people every single day who say, well, I agree with some things on this side, but I also agree with something on this side, or I vehemently disagree with the party that, you know, I most am supposed to identify with, but there's very specific issues, right? It's also a very specific issue that a lot of people are tied to, and they will not bend on that issue. So maybe that's why they see themselves falling into the middle category. But I know Arizona is going to be majority independent, you know, one day. And so we need to think about what that looks like. But I think that also speaks to candidates and elected officials to actually know what's happening in your community. You have to understand what is going on. And that's going to be the factor that will, I think, help you be successful in your race or your position. Because if you don't, and you're just adhering to one political side, you're missing out this whole breadth of other individuals who also have a very strong voice at the ballot box.
I really appreciate what Representative Austin has said, and I will just make a plug as the academic on the panel for a colleague of mine, Professor Tom Riley, who is co-director for the Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy here in the School of Public Affairs. He's recently put out a report about Gen Z voters, and we know that Gen Z voters are overwhelmingly not party affiliated. And I think that that says a lot about the future of our democracy and how we think about partisanship and political parties. I will say when I think about political parties, I think a lot about institutions. I'm an institutions person and I research institutions for a living. And part of what parties are designed to do is to create kind of the institutionalization and the backbone of a lot of our partisan political work. And so the primary system is built on parties. The way that people access and run for offices has traditionally been supported by parties. I think what we're seeing is that there are other avenues to those spaces. If we think about social media as one space where parties didn't actually jump onto social media as soon as they could have. So there are ways to have kind of more direct access to voters, more direct communication with voters, but we still have these structures that are very party dominated. And so when we think about parties here in the US, we have a two-party system. It's designed to be two, while we have kind of third and independent parties, the actual structuring of our system makes it very difficult for those smaller parties to compete. If we look at other developed democracies around the world, they tend to be more of a multi-party system that can accommodate some of the nuances. Our structures aren't designed for that. And so how we think about kind of the nuances of political and policy thought becomes really difficult in the system that we have. And I think we're seeing a lot of voters then kind of stop identifying with parties, but that creates some difficulties for how we organize not just our primaries, but how we organize kind of access to learning about the system. When students come tell me that they want to be an elected official in the future, I tell them to start working on campaigns now. And campaigns typically are supported by party infrastructure. The way that people get exposure to how this actually works is party infrastructure. And so we're at a really interesting moment in this state where the parties are becoming less important, but I haven't really seen what institutions are going to rise up and support some of those educational, socialization, and communication aspects that parties have traditionally really dominated. So I'll be interested to see kind of what happens in the future.
Well, and there are implications with this election. There are two ballot measures that could drastically affect the ability of independents to run for office. Currently, our system makes it next to impossible, frankly, for an independent to run and qualify for the ballot. The bar for signatures that you have to gather is much higher than if you were a partisan candidate. But there's a Proposition 140 could change that and set the same signature requirements for all candidates, regardless of whether they were Democrats, Republicans, or independents, and move to an open ballot primary where everyone, all of the candidates from all the parties are on one ballot. That could be something that really helps encourage more independents to participate as voters to participate in our primary elections. But we have to think about all of those things because, as you said, there's no independent party. They're independents because they don't belong to a party. So there's no machine to organize and push information out and to motivate people to participate and to send them reminders and all those things. So independents are really on their own, whereas partisan voters get a lot of communication and cues and things like that. So that's all just going to have the implications for that will just continue to grow as the proportion of independents continues to grow in our state. Something's got to change.
Absolutely.
We do have an anonymous question from our audience, so I'll just pose that now. The question is, how have transgender rights been used as a tool in political warfare? And what are the implications for civic and political engagement, particularly in marginalized communities?
I mean, it's quite obvious to me because I sit in that space, not that it should be to this person. Sorry, I didn't mean to phrase it that way, but it's very obvious to me in the space that I serve in that it is 100% being used as a tool for political warfare. And it's unfortunate because unfortunately, you know, and if you know me, and Alberto knows me, I'm not someone who says things to be politically divisive. I don't try to put anyone under a certain umbrella or assume that you are a certain way because of the letter next to your name when you vote. But Republicans in Arizona right now have really taken this issue and turned it into a political tool to really undermine the LGBTQ plus community. And largely it's tied to their religious beliefs in a lot of ways. And so that's been a really interesting thing to navigate and something that I'm very outspoken upon. If you've heard me speak on the floor, there was an instance when a very seared in my brain when Trans Day of Remembrance was being used as a political tool at the state capitol to bash President Biden for having it on the same day as Easter, which was what was presented during what was supposed to be a short prayer on the floor, turned into a sermon attacking the LGBTQ plus community and denigrating people in our state for being trans. And this is another place where I have the privilege now of speaking on behalf of, you know, my community, and people voted me to have the same voice in that chamber. And I got to respond at the end of the day and really speak to this idea that you're weaponizing religion and literally denigrating all the people that don't believe in the same thing that you believe in, and also making these grand assumptions that you know, the president was putting Trans Day of Remembrance on Easter, and I literally had to remind them that Easter is a different day every single year based on the equinox. And this person who chose to really poorly attack our community was a pastor. And so a pastor should know that Easter is on a different day every year. So I had to tell them what Easter, just for everyone's knowledge, is going to be on 4/20 this year, next year in 2025. And Trans Day of Remembrance is every March 31st, right? So but if I hadn't said that, people might have believed this person and just thought that the trans community is trying to thwart, you know, Christians all over the world and be deceitful and deceptive. And it's a really dangerous stereotype to adhere to our community. So, you know, I was able, and I was grateful that I was able to be there and say that. And so people immediately had a different perspective. And so that's the, I guess, the power, right, of having elected officials that are from our community, because we can immediately respond to just the outrageous claims that are being made. And, you know, at the very end, I said, we also need to remind ourselves that this is not a church. This is the Arizona House of Representatives, and we are here to serve everyone in our community, regardless of your religious perspective or regardless of what you think. It is our job to make people's lives better, not attack them and make them feel less than. So I think it was a very powerful moment for me, but also something, again, that showed me that that's why we need people from all communities that are representing us in the legislature.
Thank you so much, Rip Boston. Trey, were you going to say something?
No, I just co-signing on all of that. I appreciate that. And it's you also being out and representing Representative Austin. I just want, so I follow you on TikTok, and I think that that's amazing in the way that you're getting the word out and the way that you show up for people. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing that.
Okay, we're a little past time for closing remarks, so let me ask our panelists to wind us up with maybe an encouraging thought and your advice, given our theme of promoting and increasing civic and political participation by members of the LGBTQ plus community. What suggestions do you have for our students and our community members related to that? And what gives you hope at this point in time? Let me start with Dr. Portillo.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you. I will say what gives me hope at this point in time, we're past the midway point of the semester, but what really inspired me this fall is that in our welcome back meeting with our full-time, first-time freshman students, the very first question that I got when I opened it up for Q&A was, how do I register to vote in Arizona? And we were able to share out the really great resources that the Pastor Center put together with all of our students so that we could say, here are your resources, check your registration, make sure that you have everything ready to go. Connect with the Pastor Center because they're really great resources. And I mean, this was the first question coming from students. So I think that this idea of apathy from young people is just not true. Like, we have people who are really engaged, really excited. And I think it's really important that we continue to nurture that, create spaces for that, create on-ramps into this. We have a really important election coming up. I know everyone has been seeing all of the political ads. They've been hearing from folks. I hope that they're not getting too fatigued with all the research to do on our really long ballots this year, but it's also just one touch point for engagement in the political and civic process. And so I really hope that we continue to advocate for thinking about public service careers, and those careers can look like what Representative Austin is doing. Those careers can look like what Trey Jenkins is doing, because we need people to do research on this work. We need people to be electeds. We need people to be the bureaucrats who keep things running and show that you can be in positions to help your community at the local, state, and federal level. And so I hope that folks continue to explore the plethora of public service careers as they're also engaging with voting, engaging with all of these educational opportunities. And thank you again for putting this together.
Thanks, Dr. Portillo. Let me go to Trey next. Your closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all of you for inviting me here and sharing space with you. I think what gives me hope is a couple of things. One, Dr. Portillo and Representative Austin, like to see you all in considerable spaces of power and influence, and you're talking about these things in the way that you do really gives me hope. And so I appreciate that. There's certainly a time when I was in school and we all have, I think, mentioned it in some way where we're not people like us anywhere around us, and we had to figure it out on our own. And I also just have a great deal of hope for my community in terms of how I've been able to engage with community this past year and a half with data collection, and seeing how, as I mentioned early on, about we're all in a state of survival, but we recognize that as a community and we're surviving together, in the way that we give each other mutual support, mutual aid, and create a sense of community belonging and resilience is pretty incredible, and that gives me hope as well. So thanks for inviting me here. I hope I've represented my community well. Thanks.
You absolutely did. And last but certainly not least, to bring it on hope, let's hear from Representative Lorraine Austin.
Yeah, I'm really always happy to leave it on a positive note. I'm annoyingly optimistic always. And I think what is really exciting about this cycle is that, you know, again, we've had a Republican majority in Arizona for almost 60 years now. And it's changed drastically, you know, from a party of, you know, John McCain, right? Especially here in Arizona, who's very dear to us, to a party that unfortunately, I believe, has been, you know, overridden by extremists. So the positive to this is that we used to be a super red state. No one would ever believe in a million years that we could be a blue state, and we're on the precipice of doing that. And so to recognize all the people that have put in so much work, I think, to really advance the issues that people care about, and to get to this point, I think is just, regardless of what you believe or how you would like that or not to maybe transpire, is very a very historical moment for a state like Arizona to be on that precipice. And then the second thing that is really exciting, and I heard someone say this the other day, is in a state like Arizona, your vote absolutely matters. There are so many people in other states where their vote unfortunately might not matter because they have such a super majority, or their state leans a super particular way party-wise. But in Arizona, every single vote matters. So if someone says my voice doesn't matter, oh no, remind them that in the last election cycle, Secretary of State's race was decided by approximately 230 votes in a statewide election. That is unheard of. We had a primary recently for Congress that was decided by 39 votes. 39 votes. That's way smaller than an average college classroom size. So in a state like Arizona, your voice matters, your vote matters. And so I think that is really also very exciting because we can have actual change here in a state. So if you want a part in that, you can have a part in that. So make sure you vote. If you got your ballot, turn it in by October 29th. And then voting ends on November 5th. So get out there and utilize your vote because so many people don't have that opportunity.
What a perfect note to end on, because our election outcomes in Arizona are increasingly being decided by such razor thin margins. Like dozens of votes can change outcomes across the state and have been increasingly so. And that matters especially because our research on young people voter behavior, student voter behavior, shows us that young people are much more likely to vote if the people around them are talking about voting and about the election issues. So if people are discouraged about the presidential race, well, they should know that besides that, there are some really big deal ballot measures that voters will decide that will affect people that earn tips. If you work in a job where you get tips, what you take home will be decided by a ballot question that voters are deciding. The constitutional right to abortion, that's on the ballot, and other really important things. So just a few people talking those issues up and getting their friends, their family members, or classmates, coworkers thinking, oh, there's some stuff on this ballot that will really affect me directly. That can get people to turn out to vote that might otherwise have stayed at home. And just a handful of people doing that can change the outcomes of elections. And it has changed outcomes of elections. So I think that's a perfect note to end on. And I'll also turn to Tiffany and Francis for their closing thoughts on what I feel has been an exciting and very thought-provoking conversation. But thank you so much to our panelists for joining us for $0 and a good chunk of the Monday morning. I really, really appreciate your thoughts and your wisdom. And Tiffany, your closing thoughts.
Let's let Francis go first if we can.
This was a really amazing panel to listen to hear all these amazing thoughts from just very active community leaders. And I am just really struck by how far Arizona has come since even just I was a kid. I feel like I'm probably still the youngest on this panel, so so it is just amazing just how extremely red it was when I was a young kid, and now we have this amazing ability to represent so much more of our community now. And that's all due to the fact that we're getting out there and we're unifying with each other and we're communicating and just making sure that we're just getting the word out and we're voting. And I think that's just the coolest thing ever. And it gets me really excited about going into social work as a career. So thank you all for being here, and I was really, really excited about listening to all of you.
Thank you so much, Francis, for those thoughts, for being here, for all of your contributions behind the scene, always supporting me and the center with all of our efforts. So thank you. I wanted you to go first just because I was still gathering my thoughts. Because I've been back here doing all these clicking around and I'm like, wait, I gotta talk. So anyways, thank you everyone for spending your time with us. Thank you to all of our panelists for always being available for us when we call on you, for helping us advance these efforts that we have here in our center, and for doing the work that you do in the community. It doesn't go unnoticed. And that is why we continue to call on you, is because we see you as valuable members and contributors to this initiative and all of your different identities, right? Many of you have come and spoken with us in other versions of your identities. And so it's really powerful to see you get to show up in these spaces in the ways that you identify. And it's powerful for me to be able to get to show up in these spaces in different ways that I identify as well. So again, thank you to the congressman, the late congressman, for providing this platform for us to be able to even be here today. His ancestral energy is still here with us here in Arizona and here in this center. And so as we get to a place where we can begin to work across party lines again, as the majority starts to rise up as independents here in this state, I believe the congressman and his legacy is going to continue to be moving through us so that we can get to a place where we can get things done that support us all. So thank you, Alberto, for giving us this opportunity, for providing this platform for us, for being the intelligent person that you are and sharing all of the wisdom that you have with all of your identities so freely with us here in this space. As someone who presents with many, many different identities, some I share, some I don't, all of these conversations are really impactful for me. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who spent their time with us this time, afternoon, morning. We are bridging a gap here across afternoon and morning. So thank you. Thank you to everybody who's watching the replay on YouTube. If you need anything from us here in the Pastor Center, we are available to you. We're here to support you if you need to vent, if you need us to help you figure out some things that you're dealing with. We are definitely here. So thank you so much. Thank you, Alberto, for giving us the space. Back to you.
All right. So as everyone's mentioned, there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of reasons to be hopeful for the future, and we can't take anything for granted. So I think it's been a terrifically thought-provoking and educational conversation, and we look forward to the next one. Thanks again to the panelists. Have a great afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.